Audience members? Ready to go? Awesome. This is the Nationals. This is the first round for us professional debaters. Lindsay, you mean a lot. You've done a lot for me in my life. And thank you for everything deep down in my heart. But with that being said, we have a debate to have, so we're going to get straight into it. Japan should increase its military spending. As far as the definitions go, things are going to be pretty contextually defined. Japan, being that nation of Japan, should be a question of a good idea. Increase its military spending obviously is going to be the amount of spending that's taken from its GDP and throwing at military resources, right? That be upkeeping the status quo or dealing with the future. And when we're looking at a weighing mechanism in today's round, we're going to be using the weighing mechanism, what's best for Japan? What's best for Japan? And that takes us to our first contention, which is going to be the fact that Japan is a target. Japan is a target. And the main idea under this is going to be quite basic. We see that currently in the status quo. Russia is one of the best examples of one of these large nations that is deciding to make land grabs. Moreover, this is not just going to be stopping at Russia, but this is going to be other actors as well, as we'll get into. Our first subpoint is going to be that of China. We see that, in fact, for the Chinese Communist Party channels screened a video last summer that threatened a nuclear strike if Japan decided to intervene in Taiwan. Moreover, the Diplomat reported in December 9, 2019, that China's robust capabilities and the many controversial militarized and fortified artificial islands have been casting dark clouds over the policymaking. Why is that important? Well, we see that currently in the status quo, China is essentially trying to build these artificial islands to essentially have more resources. We see that currently in the status quo, every country is given an exclusive economic zone. Well, if you decide to make these artificial islands and decide to expand them more and more, you see that China is trying to encroach on that of Japan. In fact, there are already overlaps when it comes to that of different disputes of resources. And that takes us to our second subpoint, which is going to be the idea of Russia. Currently, we see that the Kuril Islands dispute is something that is actually going on between Russia and Japan now. We see that in regards to World War II, they did not sign a peace treaty specifically because of the impact that these islands are having. That's extremely important, right? Because we see that Russia has already decided that it's already making attempts towards Ukraine, right? Why did they attack Ukraine? Well, they were susceptible. They knew that there was a likely chance that there would be a high success rate. Moreover, we believe that this emboldens other countries such as China to pursue some more of these land grabs. And that takes us to our third subpoint, which is the idea of North Korea. North Korea. We see that North Korea has test-fired intercontinental ballistic missiles. Specifically, we see that it splashed down in the waters of Japan's exclusive economic zone, prompting Vice Defense Minister Makoto Oniko to call it a serious threat to country's security, right? We see that, in fact, all three major actors that we as United States citizens say are bad guys are targeting Japan in multiple different assets. And that takes us to our second contention, the fact that continued funding is needed. Continued funding is needed. We see that in the status quo, Japan has already begun to see the conflict that they're dealing with in East Asia. And in fact, they increased their budget, the military budget, to $47 billion in defense. Moreover, we see that, in fact, that is only going to be about 1.3% of their GDP. That's really important, though, as you're seeing significant actors around them. Russia, 4% of their GDP is used on military. China, almost 2% of their military is used on GDP. United States, very similar. And so I'm not advocating for a significant boost. We need as much money poured into the military as possible. But as we see that over time, we build up our resources little by little by little, that's the steps that we need to be taking, especially when we see that these resources are actually having an impact on the military that is in Japan. We see that the Diplomat, December 27th, 2021, says that Japan is striving to keep pace with China's expanding military budget, and that, in fact, it's already lapped by 4 times. We see that, moreover, that they're using this money to try to modernize their military, to trying to deal with more technology that's dealing in South China Sea. And that takes us to our third and final contention, that of Article 9. Article 9. Basically, whenever Japan was not as nice to the Western world, we saw that the United States and many international communities put Article 9 in place. Basically, Japan cannot have a military. How it's actually gotten around this is pretty interesting. We see that Japan Times of June 27, 2019, that the Prime Minister and his party have engaged in significant reinterpretations of Article 9 in relation to increasing military forces. Why? Because they need it. They are needing that more and more. Moreover, the Bloomberg 5 days ago says that for years, voters have opposed calls for stronger defense against the country's nuclear-armed neighbors. But now there's a shift, and in fact, individuals in the Asian nations are advocating that we need more meaningful action to bolster the Asians' national security. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody ready for some cross-X?
Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic speech, Mr. McCauley, naturally. But I do have some questions of clarification for you. Let's start off with, why is Japan a target for the nations you mentioned in your first contention?
Geographically, politically, they just are not really friendly with most of the neighbors.
Yeah, so why are the countries around them angry with them?
I mean, there's going to be multiple, land disputes are going to be one of the biggest things, obviously, we're talking about, encroachment, mainly that.
So what is Japan going to do with its military?
It directly acts as a deterrent. That is exactly how our Prime Minister has decided to actually reinterpret it. Essentially, if the military resources that they are using the money on is based on defensive deterrent, it's illegal. It's legal.
If the goal is to be a deterrent, and Japan is not currently being attacked, why do we need to put more money into it?
Well, first off, we're seeing that the officials have already seen that something is coming, right? That in fact, the China evidence. We specifically said that their budget has already been increasing, and it's already 4% of the GDP.
Right, so is Japan able to protect itself well in the status quo?
I would say so in the status quo, but in regards to every other country building up their resources, putting up more resources, if they are falling behind, that's a problem.
So how much money is currently being spent on the Japanese military?
I believe I had a piece of evidence talking about 47 billion defense spending in 2022 fiscal year.
Okay, awesome. And why exactly were you using GDP as a metric to measure?
Because whenever you're looking at resources and what you're allocating for, looking at the ratio in which the GDP compared to what your output or what you're spending money on is extremely important.
And then final question, how much are we increasing the military budget?
Unfortunately, I don't believe that that's a fair bright line to put on the affirmative team, especially since it doesn't say significantly.
Now let's say we don't have a specific number. Can you give me a general idea of about how much?
Yeah, so we see that every single year it's gone up about 2% of the last year's spending. So we're going to be advocating maybe double that, increasing it, right? And the GDP ratio in the status quo is 1.3. We need to be boosting that up.
How is Japan's economy currently?
I would say that it's a lot of different ways to measure it. GDP-wise, I think they're doing pretty well.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Alrighty, everybody ready to go? We need a minute.
Just one quick second.
Okay, just let me know.
Ready to go?
Alright, let's get started. Alright, very first thing, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's the last round of the day, and it's our first round of that round, so we are very excited to be here. Echoing the same sentiment as Jerry, been a very important part of each other's lives, so this is a really cool round for us both. That said, let's go ahead and talk about the resolution. It is, Japan should increase its military spending, and the first thing we're going to do is a bit of resolutional analysis. I can agree with the majority of the way he set up this round, especially that weighing mechanism of what's best for Japan. But it is important that the affirmative team give us some idea of what this increase looks like. I'm not going to ask them to provide an exactly specific plan down to the dollar or even down to the percentage, but it's important that we have some level of understanding about how much we're increasing this. It's not enough for the affirmative team to say, I'm going to throw $5 more to the military. He gave us a good example during cross-examination, saying they're going to double the amount of GDP that they're spending. Let's hold him to that since it's been put on the floor today, Judge. That means he is advocating for twice the amount of money that is currently being spent. Let's hold him to that as we move through the case. Now, what I'm going to do in this speech is start off by talking about the team in negation, my case, and then we'll look at Jerry's where it applies. My first contention is going to be decked out. Decked out. And Judge, I'm telling you, the Japanese military is decked out. In fact, it is the 5th strongest military in the entire world. The 5th strongest military. This isn't according to me, this is according to ABC News as well as AP News. When we look at this, Japan's military is among the strongest in the world. It rivals the equipment of France, Britain, among many others. Additionally, when we look at the National Defense Magazine in 2021, we talk about how major systems Japan has been buying into or plans to buy into that they currently are acquiring include things like B-22 Osprey aircrafts, Aegis naval weapon systems, PAC-3 missile interceptors, and some of the highest line equipment that exists for military personnel. And this is already taken up by Japan. So as Jerry tells you in his first contention, they are in a tricky spot, right? They're in a region where they don't necessarily have a lot of friends. But what we know is that they are adequately prepared to deter these aggressors, which is why it's been so effective. China isn't trying to get into war with the 5th strongest military in the world. Additionally, the Council on Foreign, or at least because of the deterrent, The Council on Foreign Relations in 2022 talks about how the priority, instead of increasing spending, should be focused on our diplomacy and on actually strengthening our allyships with nations including the United States. The priority should be integrating the country's existing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. But let's move on to my second contention today, which is going to be recent shift, and this is very important. According to the New York Times, in December of 2021, the Japanese government actually approved the largest military increase in spending that they ever have. Japan's cabinet approved the country's biggest spending. It's up 6.5%, totaling $940 billion. This is a $51.5 billion increase from the previous year. Judge, my opponent wants to double that. The fact is, in the status quo, Japan's economy is not doing so great. They are suffering from trade with Taiwan due to the lack of semiconductors. They're suffering due to crisis in Russia and several other things, and we have to keep that in mind today. Remind yourself, the affirmative has the burden of proof to show us that this is a feasible change. But let's look at my third contention today, which is further provocation. Further provocation, and this is easily the most important point of today's round. Jerry did a great job setting this up for me in his first contention. He told you first that China is dangerous, they've got nuclear capabilities, that Russia is dangerous, and North Korea is dangerous, and that's sure true. But I asked him in cross-examination, why? Why is there this conflict currently? And Judge, the evidence is going to tell us today that this conflict exists because they are responding to these Japanese increases in military spending as if it's provocation. AP News in December of 2021 talks about how Japan's neighbors urge them to slow down military spending. The new military spending shows an increase in the relationship with the United States and makes China and Russia feel threatened. What we should do instead of making these public displays saying let's spend all this money is work behind the scenes with our allies to gather that intelligence again instead of waving the relationship between Japan and the United States in the face of our enemies. Additionally, Business Standard in 2021 talks about how Beijing has expressed direct concern over Tokyo's plan to increase spending, just like Jerry told you. Additionally, Business Standard again in 2021 talks about how the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Mr. Li Jian, accused Japan of advocating for an arms race because they increased their military spending. Specifically, the quote is, they are trying to provoke a military confrontation. Further, Japan increasing its budget shows that China makes China feel like it's trying to meet it, leading to an arms race, and which is especially dangerous to play chicken with China. But finally, Judge, according to Al Jazeera in March of this year, Russia has already threatened to use nuclear weapons. The threat of nuclear conflict is once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of reality. Japan, if we're doing what's best for them, are not going to make the people that are already mad even more angry. Remember, we just raised the military budget in December. Doing that less than 6 months later, if we pass this resolution today, Judge, is a provocation beyond anything. But let's look at Jerry's first case. I agree with his first contention. They are a target, which is why we need to be concerned and why we can't affirm the resolution. Secondly, his second contention is continued funding. Continued, not increased, Judge, continued funding. And we absolutely should continue, funding their military, but why should they double the amount of money that they are spending, Judge? The third and final contention here, on that point real quick, he said that China puts 4 times more in. Judge, Japan is never going to be able to meet that. That's what we're talking about here. It's an arms race that Japan is inevitably going to lose. In Article 9, he really just talked about why they need to protect themselves. Sure. Judge, if you believe everything that Mr. McCauley has told you today, the most that you can walk out of this round saying is that Japan needs a strong military, which they have. So ultimately, when you look at the resolution today, Japan should increase its military spending. I'm asking for your ballot on the side of the negation because we care about what's best for Japan. We don't want to provoke its enemies. We don't want to ask them to spend more money that they don't have in order to, again, provocate their enemies and buy weapons that they don't need, when what they do need is to sit down with their allies, share information, work in counterintelligence, and do things that will actually create solutions. For these reasons, Judge, I'm going to stand down and ask for a ballot of negation.
Ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Ready to go? Judge and Judge. Phenomenal speech. We obviously have a few questions.
Sure.
You say that currently Japan is the 5th largest, strongest military, correct?
Correct.
Were they always the 5th strongest military?
I don't think so. That's why they put as much money as they have in it, and now they're in a good spot.
You made an argument where you specifically said that they are looking to buy different types of defense systems, correct? Can you list out some of those defense systems?
Yeah, so this is from 2021. A lot of these purchases were made with the budget, but it includes A and B variants of F-35 strike fighters, V-22 Oprey aircrafts.
How many of these are we having?
Yeah, so the article that I was reading talked about certainly thousands of different aircrafts. I don't have the specific numbers for exactly everything.
being bought, thousands being bought.
So it's not just being bought, things that they own and are planning on acquiring. Like they're total, they have thousands of these. They have a strong military.
How much is Japan spending on their military in this aspect?
Let's see, the total number.
Specifically this fiscal year.
I do have this card somewhere. They are totally spending $940 billion.
How is that number figured out?
I have absolutely no idea. I just said that that's what they report as their military spending.
Okay, so they report, right? You said they report?
Yes, just like
Now,
how the
was
United
that
States
billion-
reports what we
Was
spend.
that billion yen or billion?
No, that's $1 billion in US
Are
money.
you sure about that?
100%?
So whenever we're looking at the third contention, you say that Japanese, all these countries are saying that Japan is provoking them, correct?
Yes.
Just because they're building up their military?
Yeah, so this is a political theory, I wish I knew the name of it, but it's been around for generations, right? Where we build, it's the nuclear arms race. When one person has a gun, the next one wants one too, and it leads to provocation on both sides.
Who is the main antagonist within the South China Sea?
China.
Okay, and have they taken direct responses in issues with Japan?
Again, that they have directly, so the specific cards I talk about here, say how they have felt threatened, that they are considering
So
nuclear
China
capabilities.
feels threatened of Japan?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, is everyone ready to go? Ready to go? Audience members? Awesome. 3 minutes to answer a 6-minute speech. We're gonna get straight into it. The first thing that I want to talk about is the resolutional analysis and the burden that the negative team tries to place on the affirmative. She basically says that in cross-ex, I agreed that we should be increasing it to 2%. But when we really look at it, I talked about how currently in the status quo, every single year goes up by 2% of the last year. When I was at 4%, I wasn't advocating for 4% of our GDP. I'm saying we need to be increasing it larger than we normally have. Moreover, whenever we're talking about the weighing mechanism of best for Japan, I believe that the affirmative team is the only one that gives you an actual response to the current essential bullying that is going on in the status quo when you look at all 3 actors that we listed out in our first contention. But let's go on to the first contention of the opponent. First off, decked out, 5th strongest military. I asked a very basic question when we talked about whether or not Japan has always been that of the 5th strongest military. The answer is very basic. No. How'd they get it? They built it up. How did they lose it? They stopped building it up. And that's really important, right? She comes up here and tells you there's thousands of different vehicles being brought in. I do not believe that number at all. And moreover, I would have liked a little bit more specification on that. Moreover, she comes up here and says that, she says a very important phrase that I want you to pay attention to is, they're looking to buy into programs, right? That's very important. Although she does show some things that they've currently bought, she said that they're looking to buy into that. Well, what do you need? You need funding. You need an increased funding, especially since when you're looking at the status quo, obviously that money is already being used up. Going on a little bit further, when we talk about the recent shift, we need to cross-apply our diplomat evidence, which specifically says that we are looking at a $47 billion for the fiscal year of Japan. That is a 1.3% of their GDP. I would ask you to not look at her number. I believe that is a yen interpretation of the resources. And so what we're looking at is we're advocating that there be an increase. Let's go on to that third contention. Although she says that all these countries are saying that Japan's increase of funding is a threat, I believe that that's actually a concession for the affirmative team. At the point in which all these actors are actually feeling threatened by the direct funding and increase, what does that mean? They are scared. They are scared and they are deciding to not act. Moreover, in fact, we've seen aggregate increases over the years, yet no point have we seen the threshold of what she's talking about. No time have we seen the impacts that she provides. Yet when we look at the affirmatives case, which we're going to right now, first contention, all 3 of those subpoints are likely impacts that are currently facing that of Japan. We say that she's talking about military buildup. Unfortunately, you have to keep up with your adversary. She tries to paint this image that Japan's antagonizing everyone, when in all reality, she agrees that they are surrounded. Well, if they're surrounded, what do you have to do? You have to make sure that you're showing off enough money and let people know what you're about. Second contention was the idea of the continued funding. Now, her only argument is the site of my contention name. But what I did is talk about the status quo and say that, in fact, the current surge mostly hastens the deployment of troops, technologies for the next coming years. Basically, more funding is necessary for us to keep up. Thank you very much.
right, everybody ready? Jerry?
Yeah.
All right, y'all, this is already the last time you're gonna hear from me in the round, so thank you so much for your attention. I hope y'all enjoy your evenings later, but we are gonna jump back into the topic today. It is Japan should increase its military spending. Let's remind ourselves of the framework that Jerry gave us. We're looking at a good idea here, right? And we were looking at this in terms of what is best for Japan. This is incredibly important to keep in mind today, Judge. When we're looking at things that are gonna be good for Japan, it's good for them to be safe. It's good for them to have a strong military. It's good for them to be protected. It's good for them to, have a stable economy. This is the first thing I want to talk about today's round, Judge. At no point in Jerry's speech did he address the fact that Japan's economy can't handle another increase like this. Let's remind ourselves of the fact that Japan's economy is already suffering due to issues with Taiwan in trade, due to issues with Russia in trade, and a variety of other factors. Ultimately, he wants you to believe that it's not going to hurt their economy that bad. It's not that big of an increase. But the fact is, we don't even know what the increase is. I asked Jerry for some information, he tried to explain it in cross, and he said something kind of different in that last speech. And I would love for him to get up and clear this up at the end, because maybe it's just me, Judge. But at the end of the day, I feel like we should all be able to understand exactly what the affirmative team is advocating for. How many billions of dollars are we spending on top of the money that we just spent? This is another point of dropped analysis, and a reason I want you to sign your ballot to the negative right now. And that's the fact that we just made the largest military spending ever in Japan. They just raised it more than they ever have. Now is not the time. Even if you think that next year they should do Jerry's plan, that's not right now. And I want to remind you of the fact that this is happening right now, Judge. So let's look back at the flow for just a moment, specifically the negative case. First is that idea of decked out, and this is really important. We know that Japan has the 5th strongest military in the entire world. The 5th strongest in the entire world. Jerry really wants to downplay that today's round, but it is very important. We understand that their military rivals the capabilities of these militaries he wants you to be so afraid of. Now, he tries to say, let's move in order here. My second contention is, again, that recent shift. We know that we just spent this money. He has not told us why now is the time to spend even more. But third is that idea of further provocation. Now, he tries to say this is a concession to him. Judge, it is not. What we are doing is we are turning that first contention, showing you that all these people that are big, bad, and angry are going to get even more upset when in the middle of the fiscal year, we decide to increase even more money into the military. All of the analysis that I brought to you from Business Standard, from AP News, and the variety of other sources we talked about, all say that when Japan raises its military spending, these countries say, hey, we feel threatened, we might just have to respond. All of the conflicts he explains to you are so real, which is why Japan needs to be strategic. They need to be careful, and they need to be aware of the decisions they're making. But further, another piece of analysis that didn't get addressed from Jerry is what Japan actually needs to be doing. According to the experts in the National Defense magazine, again, they need to be focusing on their alliances. They need to use the intelligence, counterintelligence, and cooperation with their allies behind closed doors, not spending this money out in the public front, showing, hey, we're best friends with the United States, which only further puts the target on their back. Additionally, Judge, from that same National Defense magazine article, he tries to say, well, they're only planning on buying these. Judge, they've already purchased several of these vehicles. He wants to not believe the fact that they have thousands of military vehicles. That's fine, but it's still the truth, Judge. At the end of the day, this is something that we need to recognize. They are the 5th strongest military for a reason. This isn't my opinion, but these are the statistics, Judge. Let's look now at a few voters or reasons I want you to sign your ballot in the side of the negation. And first voter for you today is going to be stay strong. Stay strong. I am not saying Japan needs to reduce its military, that they should have a weak military and make themselves vulnerable, but the fact is they already have one of the strongest in the world. They already recognize it as a priority, and they already raised funding for it. Even if you believe everything Mr. McCauley says today, all that affirms is that Japan needs a strong military. He has done nothing to prove to you that they do not have a strong military, or that they're incapable of protecting themselves. Remind yourself of the question I asked during cross-examination. What's happening now? Have they been attacked? Is the deterrent working? Can they protect themselves? And the fact is they've not been attacked because the deterrent is working. My second voter for you today is going to be, we just did this. We just did this. Japan realized, yes, we need to increase our funding, and they did so in the largest way they ever have. Not just the traditional, yeah, we're going to naturally raise it every year a little bit, but they literally put more money than they ever have. And again, we talk about that. They put 51.5 billion US dollars into their military, according to the New York Times. That is an extreme amount of money, especially for an economy that can't handle any more than that. But my third and final voter, and Judge, the reason you should have signed your ballot to the negative in the first speech is an idea of further provocation. further provocation. Ultimately, when we have Beijing directly saying, yes, this military spending makes us feel threatened and makes us want to take aggression, why are we going to risk Japan's safety? Thank you very much. Please vote nay.
Ready to go? Okay. Oh. Now you're good. It takes 3 minutes to answer a 6-minute speech. Obviously, there's going to be some arguments that go through the flow. What I'm saying is that we paid attention to the most important arguments, especially when you're looking at the weighing mechanism of what is best for Japan. Now, let's go into the voters that she provides, because most of these actually are going to be flowing over to the affirmative team. Let's go to the first contention of the idea of staying strong and that the deterrent is working. The deterrent is working is because every single year they have been able to increase what they've asked for. They've been increasing it over and over again. Then my opponent says that we've already done this. We've increased by the largest amount that it's ever been. Well, we increased it from 1% of our GDP to 1.3% of our GDP. Yet we're not seeing any of the collapse and impacts that she provides in her speech. Moreover, what we're seeing is that if you're not funding, if you're not increasing your budget, if you're not keeping up, what we're going to see is that other countries are going to. Moreover, when she comes up here and says that her most important argument is the idea of further provocation, all this goes to prove is that Japan, or China, Russia, all of them see the link between the fact that Japan's being stronger whenever they get more funding for their military. That's extremely important in today's round, and I truly believe that that is going to be why you're voting for the affirmative team. Going over some of more of the argumentation, I feel that she concedes the point that, in fact, we're looking at a $47 billion fiscal budget. What that means is that although it sounds like it's a lot, in comparison when you're looking at all the other actors involved, how much are they spending per their GDP? 4%, 3%, all of it is significantly higher than Japan. They're falling behind. She says that they're the 5th strongest military. How do they get there? Increasing that military funding. How do you stay there? Increasing that military funding. You keep up with the pace, right? You have to keep up with the Joneses somehow, unfortunately. And that takes us to our voters in today's round. Our first is going to be the framework and what's best for Japan. Really, what's best for Japan. Whereas the negative team provides you very conditional harms, right? Hey, you know, China's going to say that they're going to be upset and then they're going to invade. Well, they haven't done that before, right? These are more conditional argumentations, whereas when you see the affirmative case, we're telling you actual land disputes that Japan is dealing with right now, that they are currently being bullied out of the South China Sea by China. How are we dealing with this? We increase our resources. She says that we have already bought and purchased several different military defense systems. Purchased several is what I'm going to say on that, right? There's going to be more in the future, and in fact, we believe that you have to be increasing that budget to do so. When we're going over the main voters, there's a situation in the status quo in which we're seeing Japan is the target. They have to continue to play with the Joneses, keeping up with the Joneses. And when we're looking at the idea of continued funding, again, her only response is, well, funding is there. They're already a strong military, then why do we have to increase it? That's what you have to do, unfortunately, when you're keeping up with everyone else. So when you're looking at today's round, you're looking at the status quo. Literally, the affirmative team is telling you that that deterrent is working. She agrees that, in fact, China, Russia are all seeing the direct impact of increasing that spending. So why would we not advocate that Japan should increase military spending? Thank you.
That was fun, man. Good round. Judges shake hands? No?